Well, thank you for joining me for this week's lesson on the rhythms of rest. We're in the 9th week of our study on rest in Christ. And this week we'll have some, I think, interesting insights into the rhythms of rest. Let's begin, as we always try to do, with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, your word is too wide, too big, too deep for us to understand completely, and we thank you for that, since it will give us an eternity value worth of study. As we move forward in this study, help us to understand what it means to have rest and to experience that rest in the rhythms of life. As one text has it, for us to learn the unforced rhythms of grace and to rest and find our rest in thee. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Well, our memory text is very interesting. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. So he blessed the seventh day. He gives a special blessing, and he sanctified it. He set it apart for his service, and he rested in it. It is when God's presence rests in something that makes it holy. It was God's presence resting upon the burning bush that made it holy. It is God's presence in the Bible that makes it holy. The paper and the ink aren't holy. The leather or whatever are not holy. But God's presence in it, as expressed in his word, can make it holy. So the Sabbath day, not a Sabbath day, but the Sabbath day, is made holy by the special presence of God in some sense. God is present in our lives every day, but he has promised to be present on the Sabbath in a special way. And that gives us the beginning of the whole idea. There is no basis for the 7-day week anywhere except in the Bible, as far as I know. There is an arbitrary number. It doesn't work out. It doesn't work out into 52 weeks. If you take 7 times 50 weeks, you get 350 days, and 2 more weeks, you get 364 days. It's just one off. That's why the calendar moves through the days year by year. So that's the way that works. Now let's remember that what rest means in the Bible, and especially in the Old Testament, because the Old Testament is the scriptures that were possessed by Jesus and his disciples. And John Walton does excellent work here, and he says the ancient world, rest is what results when a crisis has been resolved or when stability has been achieved, when things have settled down. Consequently, normal routines can be established and enjoyed. As we see, God promised rest to his children when they reached the land of promise. It wasn't inactivity, but it was the ability to do their normal routines, to raise their families, to raise their crops, to celebrate their birthdays, to celebrate Sabbaths, to celebrate the creation that God had given them. And we'll understand this better as we go along. When stability had been achieved, then the heavens and the earth were completed, and all their array, and God completed on the 7th day the work that he had done. You see, stability was achieved because the heavens and earth were completed. They were done. He'd finished building the building. He'd finished the project which he had begun. And from that way, we understand that stability had been achieved, and it was now possible for human beings to go about the process of their work in the garden. Now, we're going to look at this whole creation business in some detail, because there's a common belief that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are separate creation accounts, and that they just simply don't add up. That you can't get everything done on the sixth day that is done in the second creation account, and so forth. The interesting thing about that is that many of the people who are the most adamant that you cannot take the creation accounts literally and take the 7 days literally and so forth are the ones who press this the hardest. But they don't understand that not taking them literally in one sense doesn't mean taking them literally in another. And let's explain this. Walton himself says that what he wants to come up with, because nobody talks about literal. Nobody who says that they take the Bible literally takes it absolutely literally. When God speaks and says, "Let there be life," no one necessarily believes that God has lips and lungs and a tongue and he expels air when he speaks. That's not what this is about. That's a metaphorical statement. God expresses himself in some way that we do not understand. But the only metaphor for that makes any sense is God said. So even if we take it literally, we don't take it literally in every detail down to the granular, one each grain at a time. And so that's one of the problems here is that they may be 7 literal days, but the account is, as John Walton says, one of function, not of material composition. I've done that on these studies. I've done it in front of congregations. When I show people a picture of a building that looks like a church, they say it's a church. I showed people lighthouse, and they said it was a lighthouse. I showed people a bridge, and they said it was a bridge, and I could go on. I showed people an orchestra, and they said it was an orchestra. But those are functional definitions and not material definitions, because a lighthouse is a conical section of a tower made usually of some sort of masonry, and the rest of the building may be stick built or lumber. A church has a steeple or something like that, but even then, I showed them an abandoned church. They didn't say, well, it used to be a church, which might have well have said, because a church isn't really a church unless there are people who are meeting in it. The whole point is these are all functional definitions. I showed many pictures to audiences, and one was really interesting because I showed a hay hook to an audience, and one little girl who was far too young and did not live on a farm looked at it and said, well, it's a metal hook with a handle on it, which is what it is, but she had described a material composition and not the functional composition. Whenever we, not ancient people, whenever we know something's function, we identify it by a function. We say that's a bridge because it's something that crosses the water, for example. We don't say, well, it's concrete and steel and all these other things, which would be the material composition. So the Genesis 1 is a functional definition, functional description of the creation of the earth. The earth is made functional and ordered. Now we already mentioned this. We'll just move on here. The Hebrew root is Shabbat, which means ceasing, Shabbat. The Hebrew word nuha means rested, and manuha is a place of rest. The Sabbath and Eden were a place of rest, and resting is what is done there. So, when stability has been achieved. Now, stability can only be achieved if the starting point is instability. Now, that's an obvious thing, but we don't often think about it that way. And that's exactly where the earth was formless and desolate emptiness, and darkness was over the face of the deep. So this describes an unstable, chaotic, disorganized state of affairs. That's where the creation story begins. This is the way the earth is. It doesn't have anything that functions properly. There is no organization. There is merely random, if you will, or chaotic action, and there's no light. It's darkness. So this is where we start: formless, desolate, empty, dark, and as we say, it's the opposite of stability. So God supplies light. Let there be light. He also gives it form and function. And he called the light day. The light is not merely an abstraction. It's not really a beam of light that does nothing, but it is a period of light during which human beings can be active, during which they can see and do things. And we're not very good at night. And even though the "Let there be light" describes Eden when before the fall and before there was predation, nevertheless, and by the way, I know there are people who say that predation went on before the fall. I'm not going to take the time to deal with that issue here, but it's absolutely not necessary. And in fact, it's counter spiritual, counter the scriptural descriptions of the earth restored, Eden restored, include no predation. But we'll go on from there. So God supplies light. He supplies the function of light, which is to give humans the ability to act and to see and to do and perform their duties. And again, although this was described to a culture, described a culture which was without sin, without predation before the fall. It was described to a people. The people who received this would have been people who lived after the fall. And of course, they would have been aware that predators are nocturnal. They come out at night. And so one doesn't want to go at night. So by giving a period of daylight, God gives a period where humans can be productively and safely active. He fills the emptiness with life of all kinds. Sometimes he creates emptiness, the space between the water and the waters, for example. The dry land comes there. But he fills it with life. There's all kinds of life. There's land life and air life, aviation, the animals that fly. And there's fish and animals in the sea. So he provides that life. And finally, he provides caretakers who will delight in, who will tend to, and who will fill the earth with their own kind. God fills the earth with other kinds, every animal after its kind. But humanity will fill the earth with its own kind. And so you see how you go from a completely dark and empty and chaotic situation to one where order is continually in force and is maintained. So, and where more orderly activities, more creative activities by the caretakers, by humankind, become possible. So Genesis 1 and 2 now, Genesis 2 is also a functional account. We're going to look at that here. Genesis 1 and 2 are not two separate accounts of creation. They're a unitary description of two realms of function. God has a realm of function. He creates the heavens and the earth. And humankind has a realm of function, which is the garden, which translated over time as more and more humans lived and created more gardens, would be the entire earth. And so the realms of function, God is the ruler of heaven and earth, but then he places man in charge of the earth, including the animals, all the animals and plants there. But they're both functional descriptions, not literal in the sense of, as one of my professors used to say, bricks and mortar. So here we have, in Genesis 1, God creates, orders, and fills the heavens and the earth. It begins with a statement of desolation. The earth is formless and void. Into that, he makes light from darkness. It says, let there be light, and there are light and dark, and he distinguishes between the two, the light and the dark. The waters are divided, again, which allows there to be a space for human beings. We don't have to tread water all the time, or any of the other land animals. The land appears, separates the waters from the waters, and then God brings vegetation, plant life, because, of course, animal life needs plant life. Now, there's more, but we'll stop. We'll just fill in the right side of the chart here. God invests man with the authority and establishes him as ruler of the garden. Now, it begins just as the other one did, with a statement of desolation. In Genesis 2:5, it says that no shrub, no plant. There were neither shrubs nor plants because God had not sent the rain. And man, there was no human being to cultivate the ground. So what you see here is that the garden is going to be a cooperative or a collaborative effort between God and man. Man will serve as God's steward, as his vice regent, and so forth. He will be directly involved with the earth, but God will also be maintaining it by making the natural forces such as rain and so forth work in concert with human effort to produce an even more robust and more ordered and more fertile earth, more filled with life. Now, he made light out of darkness. Then he made man from the dust. That's what it says. From the earth itself. And that name, Adam, is quite clear. It means the same thing as earth. It is the red clay that man is made from. And in the same passage, we're taking these passages are in chapter 2, and they're in the same order as the passages in Genesis 1. And just as there was light from dark, and he distinguished the light from the dark without explicitly saying one was bad, the same thing happens in this account when he makes man from the dust, but then he gives him the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the garden. So you have these two, you have light and dark in the first account, you have the two trees in the second account, and each one contains what could become or what will become a symbol of evil, the darkness, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. All right, so there's that. These are the same elements. You can read it in your own scriptures, the same elements in the same order. The waters were divided. Now, in the second account, we get the waters too divided as well, but the river comes out of Eden and then is divided into 4 rivers. So you have the division of the waters taking place here. And again, this is because these are functional accounts, and Genesis 2, the author wants us to see that God is doing for man and putting man in a position of rulership over this earth, as God has rulership over heaven and earth, by virtue of making them, by virtue of creating them. He's going to give man a role, humankind a role in not only in filling the earth clearly, and also in bringing order, in ordering it in specific ways. And so and when God brings the vegetation in the same order, then he tells Adam that he was in the garden to keep it, to cultivate it, and to keep it, to take care of it. I suspect that what has the author of Genesis has in view is something closer to what we in America would call a formal garden, rather than a vegetable garden, for example. But in much of Europe, a garden really means a manicured space with flowers and trees and so forth. All right. Now, in Genesis 1, God rules even the sea creatures. And this distinction is important because in most of the ancient creation accounts, it is actually a battle between the good God who has to fight a sea monster in order for creation to take place. There's a battle going on between the two. But in Genesis 1, it says that God created the great sea monsters and every living creature. So there's no menace in these. They're called sea monsters because they're large, they're outsized. And if you've ever seen even a picture of a giant squid or some of these whales, you get the idea. They're unbelievably large as living creatures. And of course, the ancient mind, then, because the sea itself was a chaotic place, which was very dangerous. Even when they sailed, they tended not to sail far out of the side of land because they might have to get back there in bad weather. But in Genesis 1, there's no battle. God simply is in control. He makes the sea creatures, no matter what their size. And that's going to become important as we get here. God gives life to the animals, and each one, it says, let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind. And this means that they will be able to reproduce. There will be continuing supply of animals. And then in the last part of Genesis 1, the last part of the creation account, he makes male and female. And he commissions them. In the image of God, he creates them. The image of God, and the image of God so far in Genesis 1 has been the God who gives order, who distinguishes, and who fills with life. Those are the three basic things that he does. And so when he commissions human beings to do the same thing, to take care of the garden, to regulate it, if you will, to control it, to give boundaries, to distinguish, and so forth, and then to fill it with human beings, to fill it with their own kind. But we'll get there. It takes male and female, of course, to make the next generation, and that's what this is alluding to. In Genesis 2, man brings order to the animals. He doesn't bring order to the sea animals because he doesn't live in the sea, but it says that the animals of the air and the animals of the earth were brought to Adam. Again, we're still in the same events, the same order. The Lord God formed every beast and brought them to the man, and whatever the man called the living creature, that was the same. So notice the Lord God formed every beast. This is just, again, a functional description, not necessarily a chronological description. Doesn't mean that God had to have created them all on that day. He created them all. And then he brought them to man in this account in order to give man a function. And the function man has is to identify the animals, to give them, if you will, to give them identity, because he names them what they are. Whatever he calls them, that's it. And so human beings, humankind, are given this power to rule over nature. And there's, in the Old Testament, when you name something, you take ownership, which is why human beings were never supposed to speak the name of God. And it's here that we come upon this single time in both of the creation accounts, the single time where the words not good come along. And not good don't come along, the words don't come along because Adam is bad, but simply because the animals can it's noted that there's no mate for Adam at this point. And that means that the animals can continue to reproduce after their kind. But Adam, he has dominion. He's demonstrated that by naming the animals, but he cannot fulfill his commission because he cannot reproduce by himself. And therefore, it's not good. It's not evil. It's not bad. It simply he is not able to fulfill his commission. It is not the optimum. And so what happens then in the second creation account, there's no suitable helper found for him. That's why it mentions this. It was not good that this was the case. And then God forms the female out of the rib and brings her to the man. And now joined together, they can fulfill the commission. So we saw in the first chapter was, in the image of God made him, created him, male and female created them. And in the first chapter, it's the same way. The commission to have dominion is the first part of the commission, and the command to be multiplied to fill the earth is the second part. And so we show how that functionality is empowered by God, but is given to man in Genesis 2. So Genesis 2 is a parallel account. Genesis 1 shows how God has made and ordered everything in heavens and in earth. And Genesis 2 show how God installs or invests man with the power to rule over the earth and to fill it with life, to fulfill the commission God has given to him. All right. So, what would happen to the command to rest without the fall? Supposing that. So we have these two the creation accounts, and the thing is, the planet is ready to operate. But God rested on the seventh day. So, what would the Sabbath day look like? Well, without the fall, whoops, hit the wrong button there. Without the fall, God would have perpetually administered heaven and earth. That is, he would have kept the rain flowing, and I don't know what all the maintenance things would have been necessary, but nothing wouldn't require death or anything. It would just simply continue to keep things. I suppose the sun shining and the rain, the mist watering the earth, and so forth. Those were the things that only God could do, and God would continue to do them. He would run this enterprise. That's it. It was created in 6 days. And from the seventh day onward, it would be run properly. Now, you may not think this makes much sense that this is how it goes, but because there's no evening and morning mantra before the seventh day. All the other 6 days say the evening and morning was first day, the evening and morning was second day, and so forth through the 6th day. It never says that about the seventh day. Because the first 6 days are the days of construction, if you will, of creation, of bringing this thing together. And from 7 onward, the seventh day onward, we would be continually, the earth would be in continual operation. Again, the sun would be shining, and the wind would be blowing, and the earth would be watered, and natural forces God would use the natural forces to keep things moving. So, what would humankind have done? Well, again, they're dependent upon God for the sun and the rain, for sure, the sun and precipitation, or at least enough water to live. 6 days every week, humans would have cared for the earth, and they would be doing this to emulate the divine behavior. God didn't have to take 6 days to do this job. He could say, let the earth be the way it should be. Bang, there it is. But we were shown a 6-day regular, orderly process because he wants man to work 6 days. And so humankind would emulate God in spending 6 of their days each week, the first 6 days of each week, in creative and maintenance activity. They would order, they would multiply, and they would prune and do whatever was necessary to keep things in balance. So those 6 days. Then the seventh day, humankind would stop and would celebrate the creation and completion, and celebrate the fact that they had these beautiful gardens to tend, and they had this wonderful earth to exist on. Now you may say, what kind of sense does that make? Well, we do this all the time. We still do it weekly most of the time. But every year, we pretend to celebrate a birthday. Every year in this country, we celebrate the July the 4th, and so forth. What we're doing is marking the beginning of something that we think is wonderful. I celebrate the birthdays of my children. It was the beginning of something wonderful. I don't count the days. I don't say how many days they've been alive. I don't do any of that. I may remember the 9 months of my wife's pregnancy and all that we went through. Those are the stages of building, if you will. But once the child is born, there's something new on the earth and something exciting. And I celebrate that fact. That's exactly the way it works with creation, except instead of celebrating once a month, or once a year, we celebrate it every week. Every week we commemorate the fact that God spent 6 days, created this wonderful planet, and then he gave, we emulate him 6 days of the week by doing the same thing, making the planet, improving the planet, keeping it wonderful. And then the seventh day, we meet with God to celebrate the completion of creation. And so that's what would have happened. Now, because of the fall, all kinds of things fell apart. The lesson is also at great pains to point out the point. It says, observe the Sabbath day and remember that you were slaves. When it comes to Deuteronomy repeats the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. But instead of saying, remember the Sabbath day, it says, observe the Sabbath day. Now, they could observe it every week, and this is the point. Why it says, remember that you were slaves, versus observe the Sabbath day. They could observe it every week, for the simple reason that every week, no manna fell on it. They would observe that. You go out in the morning and say, whoops, there's no manna. It must be Sabbath. Obviously, the idea of keeping Sabbath involved the other 6 days, especially the sixth day of preparation. But the point here simply is that they could observe it. So to say to observe the Sabbath day is not a great strange mutation or change. It simply is a statement of fact. Observe it. But when the manna no longer is following, keep observing it. And then remember that something wonderful was born on that day. You were slaves. And the Lord your God brought you out. And that was the birth, if you will, of the children of Israel, of that nation, of that group. And so we celebrate on that seventh day the fact that God has liberated us, has made us free beings, and in the Exodus has returned us, at least for the opportunity to have a proper relationship with Him. So, and why would they say remember it? Well, because in Deuteronomy this is 40 years in the past, and I'm saying this ironically, as we are approaching the 20th anniversary of 9/11 in this country, and many of us have effectively forgotten it. We said it would never be forgotten, and yet it was very quickly, actually, within a year or two, pretty much forgotten. And that's the danger that, what happened, what did you do for me lately? So, when it says observe the Sabbath day, they can observe it. They can go outside their tents in the Sabbath morning and they can observe the Sabbath. There was no manna. And they then to remember that you were slaves. He's not asking them to remember something. You were slaves to sin. That's a fairly sophisticated intellectual exercise for the people as they were at that time. Remember, they still thought there were many gods, among other things. So remembering you were slaves and that God had liberated you was important. You need to remember what had happened 40 years before. So that's what this is. The big deal here is not another reason to rest, but is in fact that they need to remember why they're resting in the first place. They're resting and because God made creation. And then they're able to celebrate the Sabbath because He has taken them out of slavery. Remember that when Moses said, first to Pharaoh, let my people go, he said, let them go 3 days into the wilderness and sacrifice to God. Let them go and worship. And Pharaoh would hear nothing of it. So we're back to this, why, what is the great event, the crisis that was resolved, or the stabilization that was achieved, the stabilization of creation, the stabilization of freedom, even though there was plenty of work to be done, and you might wonder about some of the freedoms, but still, they were free as a people instead of being slaves as a people. So that's why it says observe on the one hand and remember on the other hand. Okay, back to this definition. It's important to get that. A crisis, the rest is what happens when a crisis has been resolved or when stability has been achieved, when things have settled down and consequently normal routines can be established and enjoyed. And finally, they come to this. The lesson comes to this rather interesting comparison. In Leviticus 19:3, each of you must respect your mother and father, and you must observe my Sabbaths. There's a lot of interesting things about this. We don't really have the time here. We have about 10 minutes or less remaining. Each of you must respect your mother and father, and you must observe my Sabbaths. Now, you will probably recognize that 2 of the 10 commandments are contained here. And one of the things that happens is that we tend to put, it's habitual to put the first 4 commandments on one table and the last 6 commandments on the other table. And this is commandment 5 that is mentioned first. Each of you must respect your mother and your father. Well, that's exactly what, that's an allusion to the 5th commandment, honoring your father and your mother. And then you must observe my Sabbaths is the 4th commandment. Now, I said we tend to put the first 4 and we say those are the relationship with God, and then we put the last 6 on the second tablet, and we say that's my relationship to my fellow human beings. It's first mediated through my parents. But I've long maintained that 5 belongs on both tables. That 5 is a transitional one because the way we relate to our parents has a great influence on the way we relate to God. When we think of those who raise us and give us agency, the ability to think and do and become independent beings, we primarily think about our parents. But of course, they derived their lives from their parents and so forth on back to God. And they derived their ability and understanding of how to train us. It's the Bible says in the fear and admonition of the Lord. So God is the ultimate source of life, who gives us life and gives us the opportunity to become individuals of free will. We've quoted here many times that God gave us the dignity of causality. He allows us to make decisions that will have effects for eternity, such as having children, but also we can take any of the powers he's given us and we can use them to defy him and to work against him. In him we live and move and have our being. So there you are. But God raises us to have free will, and our parents do so also. We are at the point of agency where we can make these free choices to even choose for or against salvation. And of course, the rhythms of rest, which is the title of our lesson, centers around the 7-day week that there is. We have this 7th day. And there's an opportunity to rest. I'm going to quote you to finish off now. I finished the main part of the lesson. Part of an article, excerpts from an article I wrote originally in 2002. It's been reprinted twice in Science magazine. And I'll just give you some excerpts of it, because when you understand what the Sabbath is, then you understand that it really is a celebration. The Sabbath, the rhythms of rest is we have our 6 days of work and then we have a party. Now that may sound a little strange. It may sound like the world, where they work 6 days and then they get drunk on the weekend. I'm not talking about that, of course. But what happens is that we have 6 days, and it was designed to be this way before the fall. We'll be returned to this way after the fall, and we can begin experiencing it to a large degree right now. In 6 days of the week, we do what God created us to do, which will make us happy. We will be happy when we are doing what God created us to do. That's a marvelous thing. And so when we get to the end of the week, it's like, wow, we had another week doing what we were meant to do. That feels good. And we are grateful and delighted in the God who gave us this world. So I'm going to read just some excerpts from this article, which you can find online in a number of different places. If you're interested in that, you can always contact me at BibleJourneys@yahoo.com. Let's see, there it is, BibleJourneys@yahoo.com. You can get my attention. I love parties. You may be surprised that I call the Sabbath a party. But observe how God describes the party creation. This is from the book of Job, chapter 38, verses 4 and 7. When I laid the earth's foundation, the morning stars sang together, and all the angels shouted for joy. Now there's a party of cosmic proportions. Who are the morning stars? I don't know. And angels, some of them, as Chuck say, the sons of God. Whoever it is, these other created beings also celebrate. They celebrated the creation of the earth. And I say, just as you celebrate the birth of a child, someone else's child. That's kind of what happens here. Or you celebrate the new family member. It might be a nephew or so forth, or a niece, but it's in the family. So you celebrate the birth. And that's the picture we have from Job, is that the rest of the universe, that all the other sentient beings, whoever they are, those sentient beings are all celebrating the earth, the new addition to the family. Makes you feel wanted, doesn't it? Those who don't celebrate the Sabbath must realize that they're cheating only themselves. There are people who are negative and say it's for the Jews only, but there's lots of the article goes into more details than this and covers that issue. But there are people who say, oh, we don't have to do that anyway. No, of course not. You don't have to. You don't have to go to a party. But you should realize you're missing out on things. If you've never experienced the joy of sharing creation and redemption with the rest of creation, with the redeemed, as well as with the Creator and the Redeemer, if you've never sung with the morning stars or shouted for joy with the angels, which we can do every week, we may not hear them or see them, but we can be conscious that that's happening. It's your loss. That's the birthday party of Adam's mothers, they say, the birthday party of the earth. Again, if you've never done that, it's your loss. You missed a lot of good times. And this isn't a condemnation of others. Unfortunately, I didn't necessarily grow up keeping the Sabbath in this way. I wish that I had more. And I try to do better every week so that it is, in fact, a celebration. It begins sunset next Friday. Bible days begin at sunset and end at sunset. Sunset next Friday, the Sabbath begins. The entire universe gathers for a Sabbath celebration. The morning stars will be there. The angels will gather. The whole family in heaven and earth assembles. And God has set the time aside for you too. And he honors it with his presence. Come. Join the celebration. Find a Sabbath-keeping group near you, a Seventh-day Adventist church if possible. Come and join us. And I hope that you find there the celebration that the Sabbath was meant to be. Well, until next week, when we can embark on another Bible journey together.